Welcome to this multi-experience data project on Microsoft Fabric. In this project, we'll be combining the data warehousing, data factory, Power BI, and data engineering experiences to create an end-to-end data project using the New York City taxi data. The primary focus will be on the data warehousing and data factory experiences. This project is for anyone looking to gain experience of Microsoft Fabric for data analysis, transformation, and processing workflows, specifically the data analyst and business intelligence engineer personas. As a prerequisite, please ensure that you have access to a Microsoft Fabric environment. If you want to set up an account using your personal email, then please check out the video that's on the screen now. I'll also link it in the video description. To get the most out of this project, ideally you should have a basic level of understanding and an awareness of data warehousing concepts and data pipelines. So with that being said, let me discuss the overall solution architecture of this project. We'll be using the TLC Trip record data for New York City's yellow taxis. Yellow taxis are also referred to as medallion taxis. They can pick up passengers anywhere in the 5 boroughs of New York City, but are most commonly found in Manhattan. We'll be downloading the available data for 2024 and loading this in a Fabric Data Lakehouse. The Lakehouse will act as a storage layer to land these files. These files will be in Parquet format, and each file will contain 1 month of data. If you're unfamiliar with the Parquet file format, it's a columnar storage and highly efficient file format designed for big data analytics. Once the data files are in the Lakehouse, we'll use a data factory copy activity to ingest them into a staging table in our data warehouse. The staging layer will also contain a taxi zone lookup table. This is going to be a static table, so we'll load this into the staging layer as a one-off pipeline and leave it unchanged. Following this, we'll use a Dataflow Gen 2 activity to perform some data cleansing and processing on the yellow taxi data and the taxi zone lookup data from the staging layer. We'll combine them together and load them into our data warehouse ready for serving. I'll later on replace the Dataflow Gen 2 activity with a stored procedure to show you how a stored procedure can be more efficient. We'll expose the presentation table in our semantic data model and create a Power BI report from it. So that's the overall process. Typically, you'd process the data from staging into an intermediate layer, and then from the intermediate layer, you'd process the data to a presentation layer. For this project, we're not using an intermediate layer to store our cleansed data. Rather, we'll go direct from staging to presentation, which is a simplified approach for learning purposes. We'll also need to ensure automation to enable processing of new data as it arrives each month. To do that, we'll create a metadata table called processing log. This will store the number of rows processed to the staging layer and presentation layer along with the latest date of that data. We can use this metadata table to keep track of what date we need to process next and to ensure that we don't process the same data again. Additionally, we'll delete the NYC taxi yellow staging table prior to loading any new data, but the presentation layer will contain a full history of the data. So data from the staging tables will be appended to the presentation layer. But the NYC taxi yellow staging table will be deleted as the first step of any data pipeline. I've constructed this solution for people interested in learning about Microsoft Fabric's capabilities for data analysis and BI engineering. So I've tried to make sure that we cover all aspects of the different items, such as pipelines, data flows, scripts, stored procedures, parameters, and variables. With that out of the way, we're ready to begin. All of the code that I've used will be made available via my GitHub on the wiki page, which I will link in the description of this video. Please make sure you access the wiki section here. Via the README, you can also click on this to access the wiki section. So, for example, here is the code that I've used in the pipeline PL stage processing NYC taxi. So from there, you can see the overall pipeline and you can copy any of the code that I've used. So this should make things easier for you to follow along. The New York City taxi data can be found in the nyc.gov website. I'll share the link in the video description. The files for 2024 can be found down here. Please download the data files from January through to May. At the time of recording, this is the data that's available to me. Please download these files by clicking on them, yellow taxi trip records. So once you click on it, it should download to your local computer. So do that for January, February, March, April, and May of 2024. The files are around 50 megabytes each, but once we upload them to Fabric, you should delete them from your local storage. The information contained in these Parquet files is summarized further below in the yellow TRIPS data dictionary. So once you click on that, it will show you each of the fields in the data file along with the description of that field. So we have numerous fields such as vendor ID. This is the provider, so it can be either Creative Mobile Technologies or Verifone Incorporated. We also have information about the pickup date time, the drop-off date time, the passenger count, the distance of each trip, the identifier of the location that was for the pickup area and the drop-off area. And we also have information about the rate code and then the payment type along with the total amount as well. So all of the information is summarized in this data dictionary. Going back, we also have this taxi zone lookup table. This is in CSV file format, so please also download that as well. And you can download it by clicking on it here. This contains information about the locations. So as you can see, it contains information such as the borough, the zone, and the service zone for each location ID. This can be linked to the pickup and drop-off location IDs for the yellow taxi trip data. So please ensure you've downloaded all of those files to your local computer. Okay, so in my Fabric account, I'll create a new workspace called NYC Taxi Data Project. I'll call it NYC Taxi Data Project. So click on Apply. Now, ensure you've accessed that workspace. I'll first create a lakehouse where I can land the files that I've downloaded for this TLC trip record data. So I will create a data lakehouse. So you can do that by clicking on New and going to Lakehouse, or the easiest way is switching to the data engineering experience and then selecting Lakehouse. You have this option to select Lakehouse schemas, but that's not needed because we'll only be creating files. So let me call it Project Lakehouse and then create. So that Lakehouse has been created, and under Files, I want to create a folder for the NYC Taxi yellow Parquet files. So I'll click on the three dots and then I will click New Subfolder. I'll call it NYC Taxi _ yellow. And then I will upload some files into this folder. So click on Upload and then Upload Files. So what I want to do is select these yellow trip data Parquet files. So select the 5. Do not select the taxi zone lookup CSV file. And then click on Open. And then Upload. So the files will be uploading. And they're about 50 MB each. So while that's uploading, click on the three dots under File and create a new subfolder. Call it NYC Taxi Lookup _ Zones. And then in that folder, click on the three dots and then Upload. Upload Files. This time, select the Taxi Zone Lookup CSV file and click on Upload. Great. So now in this NYC Taxi yellow folder, we should have 5 Parquet files. In the Taxi Zone NYC Taxi Lookup Zones folder, we should have 1 CSV file. Great. So now that we've done that, let's create a data warehouse. The easiest way to do that is to switch to the data warehouse experience and then select Warehouse. Let's call it Project Warehouse and create. So that's been created. So now what I want to do is for a one-off process, I want to load this NYC Taxi lookup file into a staging table in my project warehouse. So this table will be a lookup table and it will remain unchanged. So what I want to do first is in the NYC Taxi data project workspace, I'll click on New and I'll add a folder. I'll call that folder NYC Taxi Data Pipelines. So all of my pipelines will be created in this folder. Folders are just a way to organize all of your items. So click on that folder, click on New, and then Data Pipeline. I'll just call it PL Stage Lookup, like so. So now what I want to do is add a copy activity. So I'll select Copy Data, and I will just call it Copy Lookup Table. For the source, select the Lakehouse, go to Files, and now specify the file path to the lookup CSV file. So here's the folder, and here's the file. So select that and click OK. For the file format, it is a delimited text file format, and under Settings, everything here looks in order. The first row is a header. So now for the destination, select the warehouse, and we want to auto-create a new table. That will be called taxi underscore zone underscore lookup. And for the schema, I will create it in the staging schema. So that will be STG. And that's it. So we can validate. And now we can run this pipeline. So that succeeded. So now when you go to the project warehouse, under schemas, you should see a staging schema, and here's the table. And it's got the location information in the data preview. So that's worked successfully. So this will just be a static table that we won't change. Great. So for the next phase of this project, I'll create an initial pipeline that takes the data for this January 2024 file, so this one, and copies it into a table in this staging schema. Okay, so now let's ingest this yellow trip data 2024-01.parquet file into our warehouse table in this staging layer schema. So to do that, I'll create a pipeline, and I'll create that pipeline in this location, NYC Taxi Data Pipelines folder. So click on New, Data Pipeline. I'll call it PL underscore stage underscore process underscore NYC Taxi. And actually I'll call that processing. And create. So now, under pipeline activities, let's add a copy data activity. I will call it copy to staging. For the source, select the project Lakehouse, and then again select files. So the path to the file will be this directory that we created called NYC Taxi underscore yellow. So let's specify that. And then specify the file path to this January file. So that will be this file path. So you can copy this and then paste that, and actually just remove this preview bit. So this is the file itself. For the file format, make sure you select Parquet. Now one thing I'll do here is I will make this bit dynamic. So notice this part of the file name, 2024-01. This determines which file I ingest. If I change this to 2024-02, I'll ingest a different file. So let's turn this bit into a variable. So click on Add Dynamic Content under the file reference. And then notice we have variables here. So click on plus. I will create a variable called vDate and then confirm. So I'll create an expression for this file name that concatenates yellow underscore trip data underscore as a literal text string, and then this variable vDate in place of this date. And I will pass the value into this variable. And then it contains the literal text string .parquet for the extension. So we can do that using the concat function. So under functions, string functions, you have concat. It combines any number of strings together. So click on that and it will appear here. So notice the functions are prefixed with the @. So for the first string, this will be the file path. Inside of single quotes, it will be yellow underscore trip data underscore. And then I want to specify the variable. And then after that, I want to specify dot parquet. So this is the file path. So this has to be input with the format 4-digit year hyphen 2-digit month. So click on OK. So now let's set up the destination. Select the project warehouse. So for this initial run, I will create a table because the table currently doesn't exist. I'll create in the staging schema and I will call it NYC taxi underscore yellow. That's it. So before I run this pipeline, notice when I click on the canvas under variables, we have this vdate variable. We need to provide a value. If we don't, this file path will just read yellow trip data underscore and then it will be dot parquet. So we need to provide a date. So the first file I want to process is 2024-01. So I will provide that as the default value. So now we can validate and that's okay. And now we can run. So the pipeline is running. So let's wait for it to finish. So you can see from the output, it started. Great. So that succeeded. So now when we go to the data warehouse, you can see here is the NYC taxi yellow table. And you can see the preview here. We can also go to query and I want to query to see the maximum and the minimum values for this tpep underscore pickup underscore datetime column. This will tell us the maximum and the minimum dates for the data that we've processed because this will be the pickup time for each ride. So on query, I'll select the max tpep pickup time. So this is drop off. I will change it to pickup. And the minimum tpep pickup date time from staging.nyc taxi yellow. So let's run this. So it seems that some values for February have snuck in, and we also have values going back as far as 2002. So that is not acceptable because we're only expecting values that will be for January 2024. So we can actually perform some data cleansing to ensure that we only have the values in the appropriate dates. So we can prevent this by adding additional steps to filter out these records. So to do that, we can create a stored procedure that will delete all records from the staging table that relate to data that is not for the month being processed. So the query in itself that we would want to type would be delete from STG NYC taxi yellow where tpep pickup date time is less than 2024-01-01 or tpep pickup date time is greater than 2024-02-01. And by specifying it like this, it will assume that the time is midnight. So it will be 2024-01-01 at midnight exactly. And the same for this value here. So this will remove all of the outlier values. But to create a repeatable process, we need to parameterize these values. So each time we run a pipeline, we can pass in the new parameter for the dates being processed. So let's parameterize them and create a stored procedure. So I'll create a stored procedure using this query. So the stored procedure will be called, and it will be in the STG schema, and it will be called data cleaning STG. And then I will declare an end date variable or a parameter, which will be of the date time to data type, and then a start date parameter, which will also be date time to. And that will be defined as this query, except for this will be parameterized with the start date, and this will be parameterized with the value we provide for the end date. So let's run this and it will create the stored procedure. So that's worked and we should see the stored procedure here. Okay, so now what we need to do is go to the pipeline here and we need to add the stored procedure activity. So under activities, click on the three dots and then search for stored procedure. So here it is. So on success of this copy data activity, run this stored procedure activity. And I will call this SP removing outlier dates. And on the settings, I will select the project warehouse as the connection. And then if you don't see the stored procedure name yet, you will need to refresh. And then you should be able to see the stored procedure. Once you do that, let's import the parameters that we also declared. Great. So for the parameter end date, I want to provide dynamically the value for the next month. So click on add dynamic content. So what I want to do is I want to take the value that we add for vDate and I want to concat 0, 1 to it. So actually this will be easier if I show you using the set variable activity. So for now, let me leave this blank. So what I want to do is I want to show you how I can specify the end date to be 1 month after the value that we specify for vDate. So what I'll do is I will deactivate this step and I'll deactivate this step so they don't run. And what I'll do under activities, I will add the set variable activity. So I want to set a variable value for a new variable called vEndDate, v_end_date. So click on confirm. I want the value for that to be at concat, and then it will be the variable vDate, and then I will add 0, 1. But what I also want to do is I want to add 1 month to it. So I can use another function called add_time. So that's under date functions. So here it is, add_time. It adds a number of units to a timestamp value. So if I do add_time, and that needs to be in the appropriate case, like so, and I specify 1, so I want to add 1 month, like so. This will add 1 month to it. So let me click on OK, and I'll run this pipeline and I'll show you what that displays. So these two activities won't run. So I've just got an issue because of the way I've set this variable. So let me just correct that. So that should be -01 like so. So let me run that again. And that succeeded. So on the output, you can see that we now get 1 month later. So that is February of 2024. So that has worked properly. So in fact, I will just call this v_end_date. And I will remove this link and I'll actually link this activity to this one to set the value of that variable. And then I will link this activity to this one. So now what will happen is this value for vEndDate has been set to a new variable. And then I will specify the value for endDate here to be the variable vEndDate, like so. And then what we need to do for vDate here is just concat -01, so that it's the appropriate format. So this will be 24/01/01 for the current value. So now I can activate this step and I can activate this step. So this should now cleanse the data in this staging table. So let me run this pipeline again. However, one thing I'll do is under destination, I will ensure that I delete the data in the staging table every time this pipeline is run. So I will type delete from stg.nyctaxi underscore yellow. I have to use this delete statement rather than truncate because Fabric doesn't support truncate table yet. And I can also modify the destination to use the existing table because I don't want to create this table again because it exists. So click on use existing and then specify the table. So I can select the table here. So if I refresh, you should be able to see it. Here it is. It was only the first time I needed to auto create the table because it didn't exist. Great, so let's validate. And now let's run this. Okay, so that's succeeded. So when I go to the project warehouse, I go to queries, and then I re-execute this query. So notice previously we had data for February and for 2002. This time we should only have data from the 1st of January 2024 to the 31st of January 2024. And that is the case. So that's worked. So now let me add some information to a metadata table called processing log. So I haven't created that table yet, but that table will contain information such as the pipeline run ID, the name of the table being processed, the number of rows processed, the latest date in this TPEP pickup date time column, as well as the time of the pipeline run. So for now, I'll execute a query to show you what the data will look like. So I'll click on new SQL query. So I won't be able to return the pipeline run ID yet, so I can just put a placeholder value for that. So I'll just select, and then I'll just type in single quotes placeholder as pipeline underscore run underscore ID. I also won't know the table name, so I'll just put a placeholder for that. Or actually I can just even specify what it will be like. So it will be staging NYC taxi underscore yellow, for example, as table underscore processed. And then I will return count star as rows processed, and then max TPEP pickup date time as latest processed pickup, and then let's say the function current underscore timestamp as the processed date time, and then from staging.nyctaxi yellow. So when I run this, you can see of what the data in the processing log will look like. So we'll get the pipeline run ID, which we can get from a system variable. We'll specify the table processed. So this is the number of rows currently in the staging table. So this is what we'll also input. The date of the latest data that's been processed, and then the date of processing. So this is the current timestamp for me. So I want to input this into a new metadata table. So I already know the structure of the table. So what I'll do is I'll turn this query into a stored procedure, and I will parameterize the pipeline run ID, the name of the table being processed, as well as the processed date time. But first, let me create a schema called metadata. To do that, I will type create schema metadata, like so. And I'll run this. I'll also copy some code to create this table, to create the metadata table. So that will be create metadata.processing-log, and that will contain columns that I've queried here. So let me run this. So now that's run, and when I refresh this, we should see that there's a metadata schema, and here is the processing log. So I want to insert records into this processing log. So what I want to do is create a stored procedure that in essence runs this query. So let me create a new SQL query, and I will paste in the code to create that procedure. So the procedure is called insert staging metadata. I've parameterized the pipeline run ID, the table name, and the process date, and I will make that date time 2. So the procedure itself will insert into this processing log the result of this select statement. So this selects records from the staging table. As part of the pipeline, we'll input the pipeline run ID, the table name, using system variables for the pipeline run ID, and I will hard code a value in a variable for the table name, and then we'll use a system variable for the process date. So let's run this stored procedure, and that's run successfully. So under metadata, under stored procedures, here is the stored procedure. So back to the pipeline, let's now add a stored procedure activity. Here it is. So I want to link it on success of this stored procedure where we're removing the outlier dates. So I will call this SP loading staging metadata. Under settings, select the project warehouse and then refresh and select the stored procedure that we just created from the metadata schema. So let's click on the drop down and here it is. So now let's import the parameters. So here they are. For the pipeline run ID, add dynamic content. Under system variables, we want it to be the pipeline run ID. This will be the ID given to each run of this pipeline. So it will be unique for each pipeline run. So click on that and select OK. For the process date, I want it to be another system variable of pipeline trigger time. And then for the table name, I will just type staging underscore NYC taxi underscore yellow. This is a hard-coded value. Great. So since we've already processed the data and we've removed outlier dates, I will deactivate these steps, just for now. So when I run this pipeline, only this activity will run. So let me validate, and now let me run. And this has actually failed because I've got an error in the table definition of my stored procedure. So when I go back to the warehouse, notice I've got an extra underscore here. So this should be NYC taxi yellow. So let me just alter the procedure by running this, and that should be fine. So this should now update this procedure. So when I go back to the pipeline and now I validate and I run, this time it should work. So that succeeded. So now when I go to the warehouse, schemas, metadata, tables, and then preview this processing log, it appears empty, but that is just because it takes some time to update. So I'll try to refresh. If it still doesn't update, which it hasn't, I will just open up a new query. So when I open up a new query, I can type select star from metadata dot processing underscore log and then run that. So as you can see, this does have values processed. So it will just take time for the preview to update, but we have processed just shy of 3 million rows. This is the latest process pickup time, which is 31st of January as expected. And this is the current time that I ran the pipeline. And as you can see, this is the table process. So I input this value. So this is the run ID for the pipeline. Great. So now we're almost done with the staging pipeline here. So the only thing I now need to do is add a step before this copy data activity, which determines the initial value of this vDate variable. Currently, it's hard-coded as 2024-01, but I want it to dynamically update to the next file that should be processed by adding 1 month to it, because we've already processed this file. So now I want it to automatically update to be 2024-02. This is so it can then be input into this file path, and then the next file can be processed. So we can add a script activity. So here is the script activity. Let me also disable this step before I do anything to the script activity, because I don't want to run any of these steps again. So let me just tidy this up a little bit. And now for the script activity, I will call it latest processed data. And under settings, for the connection, I will select the project warehouse. So we have the option of choosing query or non-query. With query, it will be things like select statements, which is what I want to do. So we need to return the latest processed pickup value from the staging NYC taxi yellow table. So what we want to do is from this metadata table processing log. So if I actually just preview it, hopefully it's updated now. Still hasn't for some reason. So let me just run this query again. I want it to return this value, latest process pickup, and then add 1 month to it. So I want it to process this date, extract this element after adding 1 month to it. So I can do that by filtering this processing log for the table process to be staging NYC taxi yellow and for the latest processed pickup value that exists in that table. So the way I can do that is on the pipeline, I can run a query. And that query, if I click on edit, will be select top 1, because I only want to return 1 record, latest processed pickup from metadata dot processing underscore log where table underscore processed equals staging underscore NYC taxi underscore yellow. And then I want to order it by latest process pickup in descending order. So the reason we need to specify top 1 is because we can only use a limited number of functions in this activity. So I only want to return 1 record, and that will be this latest process pickup. So the max function is also not allowed in this activity. So I've had to select top 1 and then order by latest process pickup in descending order, filtering for only records for this table. So that way I will ensure that I return the latest process pickup value for this staging NYC taxi table. So that's done. So what I can do is I can run this activity. So validate and run. So that succeeded. Let's take a look at the output and let me expand this. So we return in the result sets under rows the latest process pickup value, which is what we expected it to be. The 31st of January 2024. To extract this value, we need to use a combination of dot notation because this is in JSON structure. So to access result set, and then this is an array, so we need to specify the element of the array that this is. An array contains multiple elements. In this instance, only 1, and that's a JSON element. So we do result sets and specify index position 0 because the arrays start from index position 0. Within that, we specify rows. And again, this is contained in an array. So we specify index position 0 and then latest processed pickup. That will return this value. And I want this value to be stored in a variable. And that variable will be vDate. So I can add a set variable activity. So let me select set variable. So I want it to be after the latest processed date, but before this copy data activity. So I will link this here, and then I will link this here, because this will set the variable v underscore date. Under settings, under name, we select vDate, and then we can add dynamic content. Because I've linked these two activities, the activity output from this latest processed data is available. So I can click on that. So it's not enough to get the output. What I want is output.result sets and then index position 0 dot rows and then index position 0 dot latest underscore process underscore pickup. That will return the date. So let's click on OK. So these activities are still deactivated. So let me run this to show you what we get for vDate. So here is vDate, and let's preview that. So that's worked. we have returned the value of the latest processed data. But that's not enough. We still need to add 1 month to this and format it in a way that we only extract the 4-digit year hyphen the 2-digit month. So to do that, we can add some further processing. On the result of this, I will add the add to time function for the result of this, and I will add 1, and then I'll specify month as the unit to add. So that will take us 1 step closer. So now when I run this, you can see that the latest date will now be changed to February. So now for VDate, it's February. So now for the final step, we can add a format date time function. This will format this date in the pattern that we specify. So it is under functions, date functions, format date time. So that's what I'm doing, format date time. And then the format will be 4-digit year hyphen in uppercase 2-digit M. So now when I click on run, this time the value for VDate is 2024-02. So we have now finalized the pipeline for processing the staging data. So in essence, we're copying data to staging, but prior to that, we're establishing the variable VDate, which will determine which file needs to be processed. That's done using this script. This script extracts the latest process pickup value from the processing log. This processing log contains information about the latest data that's been processed once this copy activity has finalized. So every time we add a month of data, we will automatically know which month of data was processed, and then we will set the variable to the next month. So this is now a dynamic pipeline. So let's activate all of the other steps and save this pipeline because it is now ready. But do not run it again, otherwise it will process another month of data. So under Home, click on Save. We now need to take the data from the staging tables, so from these staging tables, into a presentation table. But first we'll need to clean, transform and combine them together, and then load them into the presentation layer table. And we can do that using a Dataflow. But first, let me create the presentation table in the DBO schema. So this will just be an empty table, but it will contain the structure that matches the output of the Dataflow. So I'm going to create a new script activity, and I'm going to paste in some code. So this creates a table that will match the output of the Dataflow. So let me click on Run. So here is the table. It's called NYC Taxi Yellow, and actually let me update that. So I want to call it NYC Taxi in one word. So let me just drop this table first. And then I will create the table again, but this time it will be NYC Taxi Yellow like this. And let me click on Run. Great. So that will create the table. Here it is, NYC Taxi Yellow. Great. So we're now ready to create the Dataflow. So go to the workspace and then go to the root of the workspace, click on New and Dataflow Gen 2. If you're in a folder, you can't yet create a Dataflow Gen 2. So you'll have to go back up to the root. So now let's create a Dataflow Gen 2. You can rename it by clicking here. So I will call it DF for Dataflow underscore pres, which is short for presentation, underscore processing, underscore NYC taxi. And under view, please ensure that for the data view, you have enable column profile unchecked. Also, click on diagram view, so that is enabled. And check query settings, so that you get a query setting pane on the side. Okay, so for the data source, under Home, we can click on Get Data. And for the data source, select the project warehouse. So that will be this one, project warehouse. So for the first data source, let's select the staging NYC taxi yellow table. So that's this one. So be sure to pick the one that is in the staging schema. And then click on create. So you should see queries here. So this is the query. And then you should see query settings. This contains all of the applied steps. So if you can't see it, you can click on diagram view to change this view, and then query settings to add and remove the query settings. So let's perform some initial transformations. We won't be using this rate code ID and this store and forward flag. So let's remove those columns. Similarly, if I go across the side, I won't be using the fare amount up to the improvement surcharge. So remove those columns. I also want to remove this congestion surcharge and airport fee. So remove those. So this vendor ID column contains either 1 or 2, but instead I want to create a conditional column that places values for what the vendor is. So if you recall, we have a data dictionary. On the data dictionary, it clearly says that 1 equates to Creative Mobile Technologies as the vendor, whereas 2 equates to Verifone. So what we can do is select this column, under transform, actually under add column, we can click on conditional column. So this will create a new column called vendor, where if the vendor ID is equal to 1, I want it to say Creative Mobile Technologies. If it's 2, I want it to say Verifone, else unknown, like so. So here is the column. So let's move this to the beginning. And now I can remove this column because I'll no longer need it. So we now have vendor. Similarly, for the payment type, according to the data dictionary, 1 is equal to credit card, 2 is equal to cash, 3 is no charge, then dispute, unknown, and then voided trip. So let's implement that. So again, click on add column, conditional column. So I will call this payment underscore method. Add some clauses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then there was a 6th as well. So 1 is credit card, 2 is cash, 3 is no charge, 4 is dispute, 5 is unknown, and 6 is voided trip. And I'll also do an else clause, so it'll be unknown. So just in case it doesn't contain 1 to 6. So that's been created as well. So we can actually delete this payment type column as well now, because we no longer need it. So let me just rename the columns so they're consistent. I want everything to be in lowercase and separated with underscores. So let me change this PU location ID to be PU underscore location underscore ID. So all in lowercase. And this one, DO underscore location underscore ID, like so. And I also want to change these two columns to just contain the date element, not the timestamp. So you can go to transform, date, and then date only. So that will convert that. Perfect. So for these two columns, let's click on the data type and make them text. So vendor, text, and this one, payment method, text. For the location ID, this is an integer, and that's fine. So now I will also add a new data source. So under home, click on get data, more, and now I will select in project warehouse, the staging taxi zone lookup table. So that is this one. So click on create. So here it is, and we get a preview down here. So for the location ID, let me turn this into an integer, so whole number. I'm not going to rename these yet because I'm going to join this with this one, and I can rename them afterwards. So for now, I'm happy with the way this is named. Okay, so now what I want to do is merge this query with this query. So that instead of this pickup location ID, we actually get the borough and the zone for this location. And then again, for the drop-off, we can merge the resulting query with that as well. So we can click on the three dots here and then merge queries as new. So I want to merge this staging NYC taxi table with this taxi zone lookup table. First, I will merge it on this pickup location ID and location ID. It needs to be a left join because I do not want to lose any information from this NYC taxi yellow table. So the join kind here is left outer. So click on OK. So I can expand this and select the columns that I want. So I want the borough and the zone. Okay, so here they are. Let me drag them after this pickup location ID, and I'll rename them as PU underscore borough and PU underscore zone. So I can now delete this pickup location ID. So I no longer need that column. So now from this resulting merged query, let's do another merge queries as new, and again with this taxi zone lookup. This time I will do the join on the drop-off location ID and the location ID, and again a left join. So click on OK. Okay, so now let's expand this to get the columns that we want from the join. And that'll be again the borough and the zone. So click on OK. So let's rename this to DO underscore borough because it's the drop-off borough. And then DO underscore zone. So let's move them around after the drop-off location ID, and let's remove this drop-off location ID column. Okay, so now I will reorder these columns to align with the table that we created. So the structure was vendor, TPEP, pickup date time, drop-off date time. Then we had the pickup borough and the pickup zone. And then we had the drop-off zone and the drop-off borough. Then we had the payment method, followed by the passenger count, the trip distance, and then the total amount. So this now looks fine. So now ensure on the diagram view, we're on the latest step, and then we can pick a data destination. So on home, select add data destination. I want to add a warehouse. Click on next. For the data destination, I will choose an existing table. And that table is the one we created earlier. So the empty table called NYC Taxi Yellow in the DBO schema. So select that and then click on next. It will give us the option to replace or append data. I want to append data because this table will contain a full history of the data. So every month we will process new data and I want that appended to the existing data. So this has been mapped for us. All of the columns from the source to the destination. So that all looks in order. So we can save the settings. So now we need to publish this data flow to be able to use it in our pipelines. So click on publish. So this essentially will save the data flow. And the first time you publish, it will actually run the data flow. So as you can see, the publish is in process and then it will actually start to refresh. Once it refreshes, what we'll see is in this project warehouse, on this table, we will actually see data processed, and that will be the data for January that we already have in our staging layer. So let's wait for this to finish. And if you click on the three dots here, you can see the refresh history. So this is the first refresh. Any other time you refresh this, it has to be done on demand. So you can actually run this data flow through a pipeline, and that is what we'll do. So while we're waiting for this, let's actually prepare the data pipeline. So let's go to this folder, click on new and new data pipeline. So I'll call the pipeline PL underscore pres underscore processing underscore NYC taxi. And then in that pipeline activity, I'll add a data flow. I will call it process to presentation. And then under settings, we can select the data flow. Here it is. So we can save this pipeline for now. So we should now have this pipeline which processes the presentation data, and then this pipeline which processes the staging data. And then this was just the one-off pipeline. So now when I go back to the root, you can see this is still refreshing. So currently on the project warehouse, this table is still empty. So I can try to query it, and then there's nothing there. So as soon as this stops refreshing, so as soon as this stops rotating in a circle, then it should be populated with data. So the data flow looks to have stopped refreshing. So as you can see, the refresh is finished. So now when I go to the warehouse and I run this query again, we can see that data has indeed been populated in this NYC taxi yellow table in the DBO schema. So this is our presentation table. So the data flow has run. So additionally, what I want to do is I want to update this processing log with the information of the number of rows processed, the latest process pickup, the processed date time, as well as the pipeline run ID and the name of the table. So to do that, what I can do in the pipeline that I've just created, so this PL Pres processing NYC taxi, which runs this data flow, I also want to run a new stored procedure against that data warehouse that will populate the information. So what I'll do in my data warehouse, on the query tab, I will actually paste in some code that creates a stored procedure. So this creates a stored procedure in the metadata schema called insert presentation metadata. It's essentially the same for the one that inserts the staging metadata, and it contains the same parameters: pipeline run ID, table name, and process date. The only difference is this time it queries against this DBO NYC taxi yellow table, so the presentation table. So let me run this. And that succeeded. So I can now go to that pipeline, so this presentation pipeline, under activities, add a stored procedure activity. I will call it SP loading presentation metadata. Under settings, I will select the warehouse, and then I will refresh, and I will select the stored procedure. But I also want to connect it to this data flow. So once the data flow runs, I want to run this, which populates the metadata. So it has to be in sequence. So let's wait for this refresh to finish, and then I'll select the stored procedure. So that's done. So it's this stored procedure, insert presentation metadata. Let's import the parameters. Great. So for the pipeline run ID, again, it will just be from the system variables, it will be this pipeline run ID. For the process date, it will be the pipeline trigger time. And for the table name, it will be presentation underscore NYC taxi underscore yellow. So this is a hard-coded string value. So let me deactivate this because I don't want to run the data flow again, otherwise it will process the same data again. I will just run this stored procedure activity. So let's validate and let's run. So that succeeded. So when I go to the warehouse and I locate one of the queries where I have queried the processing log and click run, you can see here is the information for the presentation NYC taxi yellow table. So the number of rows matches because this is the first time we've processed it, so that's what we'd expect. The latest process pickup, and I believe the reason the latest process pickup is this value and it doesn't contain this time element is because this was converted to a date. So that is fine. So we've now prepared all of the steps for processing the presentation layer. So I can now activate this step as well and then save this pipeline. Now that we've prepared the pipelines to process the staging and the presentation layers, let me create an orchestration pipeline. This pipeline will invoke both of these pipelines. So via one pipeline, we can actually run the end-to-end data process. So on the workspace, ensure we go to this folder, click on new, and then data pipeline. So I'll just call it PL underscore orchestrate underscore NYC taxi. So on the pipeline activity, I will add an invoke pipeline activity. I'll just call it invoke staging pipeline. And I will actually just copy this, and I will call the second one invoke presentation pipeline. I will link them together, so the staging should run first and then the presentation. So for the staging one, under settings, select this staging pipeline. And then for this one, under settings, select the presentation pipeline. And that's it. So notice currently, when I run this max and min, but I will run it against the DBO schema, we only have the data from the 1st of January 2024 to the 31st of January 2024. So now when I run this, I also expect data for February. So let's just ensure that all of the activities are activated in both pipelines, and they are. So now I can actually validate and run this pipeline. I can also schedule it to run periodically, as you can see by clicking on schedule, but I won't do that because I'm just going to manually run them. So let's click on run. So this should now process the data for February. So let's wait for this to finish. Great, so that succeeded. So the invoke staging pipeline took 1 minute 36 and the invoke presentation pipeline took 2 minute 44. So now if we go to the project warehouse, let me query this metadata processing log. So currently it only shows this, which is outdated. So I will actually just run a query against it. And now, as you can see, when I order this by process date time, this was the first run where, as expected, we processed the same number of records in both. However, in the second run, we processed the data for February, and it was about 3 million records. So this number here, 5,972,117, is the sum of this and this. So this contains data for January and February. Whereas for the staging layer, we delete the table prior to each load. So this just contains the number of rows processed for each month, whereas this is the total number of rows up to the current date. So that seems to have worked properly. So this pipeline is now working end to end. So every time I run this, we'll process a new file. So in our lakehouse, so far, we've processed this file and this file. So if I run the pipeline again, it will process this one, and then this one, and then this one. So we can also schedule this orchestration activity, as I told you, to run on a monthly schedule every time we expect a new data file to be loaded into our project lakehouse. So we have completed the data pipeline part of this project. We'll now actually use this data and create a Power BI report. So now that the pipeline's working, and in our project warehouse, we have got the presentation table here that's populated with 2 months of data. Let's actually add this to our semantic model so we can use it for Power BI reporting. So go to reporting and then manage default semantic model. So select the table in the DBO schema called NYC Taxi Yellow and then confirm. Great, so that should be added to the default semantic model object. Here it is. So we can now, under reporting, click on new report, or in the workspace, go to new and then report. So this will help us create a Power BI report. So let's pick a publish semantic model, and that will be for this project warehouse. So I don't want to auto create a report, I will create a blank report. So here is the table. It is now available for us to use. So what I'll do is I'll quickly create a Power BI report from this data. So here's my report. It's called NYC Yellow Taxi Report. Along the top, I have 3 filters. So I've got a date slicer, which can filter all of the visuals according to the date range that I select. So currently we have data from January and February. We also have the ability to filter by payment method and by vendor. We then have KPIs. So we got the total revenue in USD, the total number of trips, and the total number of passengers. We have a bar chart that shows the daily revenue by date and payment method. We also have a table here, which shows the most frequent journeys from pickup and drop-off boroughs. And as expected, Manhattan to Manhattan is the most common. And as I said, we have the data for January and February. So if I refresh this orchestration data pipeline, this report will also update to contain data for March. So I can actually do that. Let me run this pipeline manually. So I'll click on Run. Okay, so that's finished. So now when I go to my warehouse and in queries, when I run this query for the processing log and then order it by process date time, we can see in the latest batch, we processed around about 3.5 million records. And in total, in the presentation table, we have just over 9.5 million rows. So now in this Power BI report, currently we have data up to February. So when I click on refresh, we now have March here as well. So the current trend is that from January to March, the revenue is increasing. And the most common form of payment is credit card. We can also see that if I filter by creative mobile technologies, then the daily revenue is much lower compared to Verifone. So the vast majority of rides are through the vendor Verifone. And similarly, and then we can also filter to see how many disputes occurred and how many instances that there were no charges. So there seems to be a peak on this date, which was on the 20th of January 2024, and that was around $18,000 in a single day, where the norm seems to be around $5,000. But other than that, everything seems to be in line, apart from this drop here on this date. So there were far fewer rides on this date. So that in essence is the end-to-end data pipeline. In our pipeline, we used a Dataflow activity for this processing step. So specifically in this PL Pres processing NYC taxi pipeline, we are referring to a Dataflow. So instead of a Dataflow, we can also use a stored procedure or script activity to process data from staging to presentation. In many cases, the stored procedure activity can be more efficient than Dataflows because Dataflows have a lot of overheads. So in my data warehouse, I am going to open a new SQL query. And on the screen, I'm pasting some code that will create a procedure. So this code is creating a procedure called process presentation in the DBO schema. It's essentially inserting into the DBO NYC taxi yellow table, which is the presentation table, the result of this select statement. So this select statement is just mirroring what we've done in our data flow. So essentially it's taking records from this staging NYC taxi yellow table, it's performing a left join on this taxi zone lookup table in the staging layer, and then it's also performing another left join with that taxi zone lookup table to return the same information we did from our data flow. So all of the code is available in the wiki in my GitHub page, so you can review this in your own time. But this is essentially SQL that's translating what we've done in our data flow. So let me run this to create the stored procedure. So that succeeded, as you can see. So when I go to the DBO schema and stored procedures, here is the stored procedure. So now I can go to this PL Pres processing NYC taxi pipeline and add a stored procedure activity. So this will run instead of the data flow. So let me deactivate the data flow and create a link between these two activities. So I will call this activity SP processing or process to presentation. Or actually, let me just say processing presentation. And then under settings, I will select the connection to the warehouse, and then I'll refresh and I'll select the stored procedure that I just created. So here it is, DBO process presentation. Great. So now let me save this. And notice this Dataflow activity is deactivated. So now on the orchestration pipeline, I will run this again. But just note currently, we have data for January, February, and March. So let me run this orchestration pipeline again to process the data for the next month. So I'll validate, and that's all good. And now I'll run. As you can see, that's successful. In fact, the invoke presentation pipeline stage was even faster, so it only lasted 32 seconds. Previously, it was around about 2 to 3 minutes. So there is a significant improvement. This is because generally there's much more overhead and inefficiency with Dataflows. The reason I initially did this with the Dataflow Gen 2 activity was because I wanted to show you how you can make use of the different items in Microsoft Fabric. So when I go to the project warehouse and I run that query again, that selects the top 100 records from the processing log, we can see that we've processed an additional 3.5 million rows. And the presentation layer now consists of over 13 million rows. So on the Power BI report, I can refresh. And now as you can see, we've got data for April as well. So now if I run this pipeline one more time, we should have processed all of the data files in our lakehouse. So here's the project lakehouse. So we only have May left to process. So let me just run this pipeline one more time. So that's succeeded. So let me go to the warehouse. I will rerun this query, sort it by process date time. So just as a note, if you wanted to trace this activity back to the pipeline run ID, then what you can do is you can go to monitor, and then here are all of the pipeline runs. So notice as part of this orchestration activity, there are two sub-activities. You can see the pipeline run ID for this one. So this invoke staging pipeline has got the pipeline run ID A1 EAE. So you can click into it to be taken to the details for that activity. And like I showed you on this table, when I rerun it, here is the pipeline A1 EAE. So that is how you can trace it to the pipeline run ID. And now as you can see, we've got the data for May. So we've processed 3.7 million rows. So when I go to the Power BI report and refresh, we now have the data for May. Great. So that's the end of this project where I've created an end-to-end data experience for the New York City taxi data. If you haven't already, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more content like this.